I was destined to be a horror movie fan from a young age, across the spectrum from the high camp of Friday the 13th, 8 Jason Takes Manhattan, to the legendary terror of Alien. My mother was a secret horror fan and tried to steer me toward more age-appropriate things like Hocus Pocus and Goosebumps novels, rather than her secret favorites like Hellraiser and Jeepers Creepers. I learned the finesse of the return button on the TV remote, like picking a lock, when I was about 12, and I started to catch horror movies playing past prime time. This was when I met my first of the classic cult horror movies, gruesome and thrilling films, often on a short budget with a dedicated and loving fan base that I had been initiated into as I watched in my dark living room, my anxiety heightened as I listened for my parents possibly catching me watching something they didn't want me seeing. I first saw films like Wrong Turn, Primal, and Pandorum this way. As an adult, I've continued to seek out cult horror films, and I take a special joy in the earnestness of them. Some cult horror really try for something philosophical, while others simply revel in the camp of well-trod yet sturdy horror tropes. The best wind up doing a bit of both. There's nothing quite like that first flutter of excitement and discovery when I find an underground horror community circled around someone's passion project in film. It fires me back to finding a ratty Goosebumps paperback in a thrift store that I didn't have in my collection yet, thrilled knowing my mother wouldn't hesitate to spend the dollar to keep me reading. This is what I initially felt when I went to watch Terrifier. The enigmatic and sinister clown serial killer from the movie was something you didn't forget. A ghostly terror haunting horror accounts on Instagram and thumbnails of creepiest movie monster videos on YouTube. The stars had aligned for its release, the film launching just a few months after the viral mass scare around killer clowns in 2016. I was ready to see how the creator had captured such a perfect image of this almost primal fear people had of the clown slasher. I watched the film and I came away perplexed, deflated, and a little angry. I expected it to be a movie that would fit neatly onto the shelf of gruesome cult horrors I love, like the original Saw and the Wrong Turn series. But it didn't. I didn't like it at all, and in a lot of ways, it didn't even feel like a coherent horror movie. Now, this isn't Cinema Sins. I have some serious critiques, but I'm going to deliver them with some introspection and intellectual honesty, hopefully. As with all cult favorites, Terrifier has a dedicated fanbase, and if you are a fan, I hope you'll hear me out. Oh boy, does this one have a content warning. Please, if you are not familiar with Terrifier, pause the screen and take a read at what is going to be involved here. So let's start with a basic summary of Terrifier. The movie opens with an old analog TV playing a talk show interview with the only survivor of the Miles County massacre that happened a year prior. She has been dramatically disfigured by the ordeal, and it plays this out in a way that is kind of milquetoast in vain. The victim says she lives in solitude and was distraught and suicidal when she first saw her scars. The interviewer then mentions that her attacker's body disappeared from the morgue after the event, and the victim says she knows he's dead, she saw it happen. The TV we are watching is kicked, and the killer of the movie is revealed in a montage with the opening credits. Art the Clown is assembling his weapons and putting on his makeup, presumably for another massacre. We then cut to the talk show host on the phone making fun of her guest's appearance to her boyfriend. She is then attacked in her dressing room and mutilated by her guest, gouging out her eyes and then giggling as we get the title card. So we have our blood sacrifice and the slasher cycle begins. We then meet Tara and Dawn, two young women making their way home from a Halloween party a little too drunk to drive. As they argue over the keys to Dawn's car, they see Art standing ominously in the shadows down the street. After a tense standoff and Dawn trying to invite him over, he disappears, leaving Tara feeling deeply unnerved, while Dawn is a little too drunk to see the encounter as anything other than a joke. They go to a pizzeria to sober up, and Art follows them there, making ominous eye contact with Tara the entire time, before he's eventually thrown out. Tara and Dawn return to their car to find its tires slashed, and they wait for Tara's sister, Victoria, to come pick them up. As they talk about the creepy encounter with Art, who Dawn still insists was harmless, Art returns to the pizzeria and murders both workers there. We also learn why he was thrown out, for throwing shit all over the bathroom walls. Tara then approaches a maintenance man as he steps out of a nearby building for a cigarette, and she asks if she can use the bathroom inside. He relents and lets her into the derelict, infested building he's preparing to bomb for rats. While Tara is inside, Dawn is surprised by Art and abducted. Tara hears something as she leaves the bathroom and encounters a squatter with the delusion that Tara is her new neighbor. Tara plays into the relatively harmless delusion and slips past the woman. Tara then runs into Art in the entry of the old building, blocking her exit. From here on out, the movie essentially becomes a level in the video game Dead by Daylight. Eventually, Tara is caught, injected, and wakes up being menaced with different weapons by Art. He then reveals Dawn and bisects her with a bone saw in front of Tara. She escapes briefly and gets the drop on Art with a 2x4, until Art pulls a gun on her and ends things. The squatter woman sees this and goes to the maintenance man for help. While this is going on, Victoria arrives and is looking for a way into the building. The maintenance man brushes the squatter off and goes to make a call, but Art strikes before he can. The squatter woman finds Art with the doll she calls Emily and approaches him, desperate to get it back. She asks if he can show mercy, begs for the doll back, and cradles Art's head as he seems to capitulate to her attempt to reach him. We then return to Victoria as she searches the building for Tara and Dawn. She finds Dawn's corpse, hears a scream from deeper within the building, and runs after it, thinking it's her sister. She finds Art wearing the scalp and flayed chest of the squatter. He chases her while doing a creepy Buffalo Bill bit. Now we're in a second game of Dead by Daylight, where Victoria finds Tara's body and Art catches up to her. Just as she is about to be killed, the maintenance man returns, having only been knocked out by Art's attack. The two manage to make a 911 call before Art gives chase again, catching up to and killing the maintenance man. Victoria barely evades Art and hears sirens approaching. When she looks through a crack in a chain door, she sees Art behind the wheel of a truck. It comes barreling through the door and we see Victoria twitching on the ground. The police arrive and find Art eating Victoria's face before he shoots himself. They then reveal that Victoria is still breathing. We then cut to the morgue as the bodies come in, and when the coroner opens the bag containing Art, he reanimates and kills the coroner. The last thing we see is Victoria being released from the hospital, and it is revealed that she is the sole survivor from the beginning, and that we have just witnessed the Miles County massacre mentioned in the beginning. Oh, and the credits end with "In memory of Wes Craven, George A. Romero, and Tobe Hooper." Initially, for me, this film failed to deliver on everything it set up from either a story or thematic standpoint. The first whiff of themes I got was from the most obvious and on its nose theme of a creep stalking women on their way home. I followed this thread through most of the movie, but it was unfinished and languid. the ending didn't take it anywhere and doubled back over the beats for the sake of escalating violence. Specifically, I found the scene with the skin wearing simultaneously superfluous and concerning. It was clearly taking inspiration from an old trope in horror that really goes back to Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs. With that, intentional or not, it brings a heavy chain of transphobic baggage. Now, I'm willing to admit that I'm on a hair trigger for this one. I live in a world of dog whistles, persecutions, stochastic and organized violence towards people like me. I have had a few instances before with books or movies that have tripped my sensors and were ultimately false alarms. It's hard to say if this scene is contributing to this consciously or not, but I don't think its intention changes the chilling effect, and not the way the creator intended it to be chilling. It doesn't enhance the horror or challenge the audience. It takes me out of the moment and leaves me wondering what the film is actually trying to say, if anything. Especially given that horror, as a massive genre, often can be guided by some truly heinous ideology in the subtext around the screaming and slashing. To quote one of my favorite horror writers, "The political baggage of horror is considerable, and oftentimes problematic. Many a smart person has argued, and convincingly so, that the horror genre is a conservative, reactionary one, too often with the ugliest political shades on display. Misogyny, homophobia, xenophobia, ruling class reimaginings of the other as invading monsters." With this heightened alert level and ambiguous approach to its own resolution and themes, Terrifier had me deeply concerned that what I had just watched was some dark internal fantasia about violence against women for no discernible reason beyond that Art the Clown is evil. I was put off by a through line of bizarre moments that could be read as transphobic. The bathroom incident at the beginning, the fixation on appearance and destroying appearance, the attempt at a theme around motherhood or lack of, all of this on top of the reference to Silence of the Lambs. That's simply one interpretation though, and frankly one I'm sensitive to. It was what initially made me want to dive deeper on Terrifier, to see what it might actually be trying to say, or if my overactive transphobia sensor had gone off correctly. Not only that, but the movie does have a few honest moments that belie a greater understanding of the real terrors that two women might face on their way home from a party. The moment where the pizzeria owner asks Tara specifically if she is okay.
Yes.
You two okay?
Oh, he's harmless.
You okay? Don't worry, I'll take care of him. Enjoy your pizza.
And the interactions with the exterminator in the building. These show that the writer has at least heard a story or two and given it some thought. I mean, there could even be a counter-argument to my reading, saying that you could read Art the Clown as a metaphor for transphobia, haunting and following a woman as she just tries to get home and use the bathroom. I'm not just saying that because Tara has a voice I want.
Yeah, but what if I'm right and he's out there watching us right now?
The actress Jenna Cannell is genderqueer and is she they, so just peak voice. Let's give Terrifier a fair shake though, and try some possible readings. Really early, we can see a theme develop around the very real threat of two drunk girls trying to get home and encountering a strange man who then follows them before attacking them both. I could see this work. I mean, if Tara had been the final girl and her more careless friend serves as fodder for the struggle, but Tara doesn't make it, and her sister doesn't come away unscathed either. Is this film saying only the good girls make it if they stay home and study? I don't think that's the intent, even if there are some strong points in the beginning to support that reading, so let's discard this one. Maybe Art the Clown is supposed to represent irony-poisoned misogyny. The kind that makes a joke of acknowledging itself, but continuing to do it. The classic, I'm not going to say X about women, and then proceeds to say X about women. A type of Reddit chud we've all encountered at some point on social media, or God forbid, in real life. This works well with the escalation of violence as he racks up various forms of rejection. The hatred becomes palpable with the types of violence that fixate on the face and sexualized parts of a woman's body. But what does the ending say about this? Like, that it's inevitable and unkillable and it will get you unless you stay at home? I mean, this is a much stronger read of the first two acts of the movie, but it delivers nothing in terms of resolution. And I think the creator might have been going for something like this, but utterly lost the thread by the end. We can try so many things on for size with Art the Clown specifically, like focusing on him as a character. Does he represent misogyny and how seemingly harmless men become violent? Does he represent a cycle of violence and how Victoria apparently turns murderous at the end? Does he represent the fear that something familiar and harmless could actually be a serial killer? Is he just meant to be evil incarnate, murdering the innocent and debauched alike until the cops show up? It's really hard to tell, because these ideas can fit well onto the film, at least initially, but go nowhere coherent and even subvert themselves at times. I don't think anyone trying to make a point about male violence would end their story with the final girl being helped by a man and then killing another woman. I'm willing to give the creator, Damien Leone, much more credit than that. I don't think he's a good writer, but I also don't think he's a cheap misogynistic hack. I can't help feeling like this movie is missing something critical that would tie together these loose ends. Or maybe something I'm missing in the broader story here. I think this could be narrowed down to one thing that needs clarifying. The answer likely lies with the main focus of the film, the killer clown himself, and his origins. This takes us to the first films Art appeared in before Terrifier made it to theaters, and to Terrifier's sequel, Terrifier 2, Terrifier Harder. Art's first appearance is in a short film called The Ninth Circle from 2008. In this movie, Art kidnaps a woman from a train station to be sacrificed by a satanic cult. This film establishes Art's mannerisms and silent style of toying with victims before revealing his violent intentions. He is only a supporting character in this film. He appeared again in 2011 in another short film titled Terrifier. The Ninth Circle and Terrifier are included in the first feature appearance of Art the Clown with the 2013 release of All Hallows Eve. The previous two short films are shown as part of a VHS found by a babysitter and the two kids in her care. They watch it after finding it in one of their trick-or-treat bags, and by the end of the tape, they find Art has entered the real world. This brings us to the feature-length debut, Terrifier, in 2016. Art the Clown is now played by David Howard Thornton. The guy has a gift for weird murder characters. He played the Grinch in the murder parody movie, The Mean One. Other than setting up Art's modus operandi, the previous installments before Terrifier 2016 don't add anything to the lore or the possible interpretations of the film. If anything, they cement my hypothesis of him representing this crypto-reactionary instinct in horror. The way women are treated, mutilated and degraded, mixed with the religious imagery and focus on the satanic, does not fill me with the warm and fuzzies. Or with the creepy crawlies you actually want from challenging, subversive horror. This actually begins to get even more cogent in Terrifier 2, which is honestly much of the same, only now with an actual final girl rather than a fake out like the first film. Honestly, it was better, but this shtick begins to get tiring after a while. What carries it for me is just how well David Howard Thornton sells the menace as he performs. His co-stars hold up their end as well. They're not winning any awards, but they're definitely pulling their weight. That said, the fixation the creator has is clearly on the figure of the silent murder clown. Taken as a whole, the appearance of Art begins to feel more like a fanfiction OC. inserted into a series of cliche horror tropes, menacing strangers, caught witnessing a murder, satanic ritual sacrifice, etc. If that's the intent, well, I mean, I'm not really in a position to judge. The second movie fascinates me almost as much because it seems to come right up to the edge of realizing that this feels more like a haunted house ride than a movie, but also wants you to take it seriously as it gestures at concepts that have no substance, like the food shown in a fast food commercial sprayed with DEET to shine and glued together to look flawless. The actors sell it. The director of photography knows how to line up a shot, and the practical effects are gruesome and shocking. The writing, though, I can't tell what it's going for. Some amalgamation of Jason Voorhees and Jeepers Creepers with the clown aesthetic everyone shivers at from Stephen King's It. So the broader story surrounding Art as a character is about as devoid of meaning or overarching theme and relies heavily on performance. That, and I haven't found anything that can assuage my concerns about what undercurrent might be present in these movies. For answers, we can turn to the creative minds behind the movies. One of the conveniences of these indie films being small projects is that the director and the writer are one and the same throughout. So let's take a look at Damien Leone. So this guy is the director, writer, producer, editor, special effects guy for both Terrifier films as well as All Hallows Eve. He's about as responsible for the content in these films as any one person could be. Leone talks about creating the character Art the Clown back in 2005 for his first film projects, confirming the idea of this character really predating any of the stories he appears in. Leone's background is in special effects, and he refers to specifically liking controversial horror movies.
Were you aiming to be controversial with the first film's violence, or just as entertaining as you could be?
I'd be lying if I said no. I knew that the kills were going to be controversial. I grew up loving controversial horror movies, and especially being sort of like two things. One is, since I am a special makeup effects artist, and we're not dealing with a big Hollywood studio, we don't have a lot of money, that I know I could personally do things for very little money in the special effects world that you're not going to see in a Hollywood film, in like a Hollywood horror movie. So if I could bring that to the table and that gets people talking and excited, and they'll say, hey, I'll check out this indie film over this big Hollywood movie, or just give them something different. I mean, how are you going to compete against the big boys? So knowing that I could do things like that, and my obsession with Tom Savini since I'm a little kid and doing makeup effects, I wanted it to be as gory and not so much controversial, but very shocking and in your face. I mean, there's no doubt about it that I knew we'd be exploiting the violence.
I think there's a little lost in language here, and I'm going to lean on something Paul Tremblay speaks about in his essay on politics and horror. When Leone, and to be fair, the interviewer in this case fed him the word, calls something controversial, what I think he really means is that it is specifically transgressive. He refers to some of the kills and gore in Terrifier being controversial, which implies something more broad and simplistic than what is actually going on. To quote Tremblay, the breaking of taboos, the blasphemy, the exploitative and icky prurience, the gore, etc. He specifically sets up his practical effects and edginess as a draw, a tool to bring attention to his work where he can't produce what big Hollywood budget films can with big names and marketing. He wants to use what he has learned in special effects makeup to create the goriest, most shocking showcase he can. Honestly, it sounds like someone who would make an amazing haunted house. Now to the transphobia. He has actually been directly challenged on this, and his response is interesting.
Was there a particular criticism or take on the film that surprised you, caught you off guard?
I mean, look, I get constantly accused of being misogynistic. Of course, today it's inevitable. What really shocked me is transphobic, I've been called, based on the scene where he skins and wears the woman. I mean, listen, it makes me laugh because it couldn't be any further away from what I am. Raised by all women and everything. Like I'm just like it's so funny to me, and I think I'm just like so comfortable because I was raised by all women that I don't think about those things when I'm doing it. I don't think I'm offending. I'm not trying to offend. So there's really nothing I'm not afraid to show. I mean, there's things I won't show that maybe there's even like lines that I try not to cross, believe it or not. No matter how grotesque and intense these scenes get, I always keep it in the back of my head, like how far can we push it, but still maintain some level of like accessibility.
So this is actually a good answer that shines a light on a lot of what I was looking for on this guy. Genuinely, he seems harmless. He's a horror nerd who has a very practical skill and a monster OC. He's a little naive. As a cishet white man, he certainly has blind spots, and it seems to just like pushing the boundary to try and present his audience with something unique. I have to admit, after looking him up, I have a bit of a soft spot for Leone, because he looks a lot like a guy I used to work for who was a gay Jewish man from New Jersey. He was an absolute delight. With the actual creator addressing the specific criticism, though, we have to break it down. I believe him when he says he didn't intend for it to be transphobic, but I still think it is. Why? When we look at his influences, who he admires, we can see his inspirations. He's a classic horror nerd. 70s nudity and gore, sleepaway camps and slashers. He mimicked the horror of skin wearing we've seen in more than one horror film. Leatherface in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and James Gumb from Silence of the Lambs. I don't think Damien Leone sees his mimicry as transphobic because he doesn't seem to understand the implications or underlying themes of the influence. I think that's true for the moments that seem misogynistic or simply meandering without a grounded purpose, too. So many instances in Terrifier have this, wow, gross. Okay, so why was that there? Question attached to them. I think it's because Damien wanted to do the special effects more than anything. There's more to this movie than just the story of Art the Clown and how Damien has crafted his character. He's first and foremost driven by a tableau created by his talent in makeup and effects. From this, he extrapolated short films and then full-length films, where he continues a similar creative process. Dismisses the entire world of theme and meaning his influence is built from the ground up. The very philosophy of how these movies are made is worth examining, so we can see exactly where Leone has missed the thread. I think it's because he thought his art is a clever amalgam of his favorite horrors in a new way. He clearly loves horror, but I don't think he knows why. When we bring the products of our labor into relation with each other as values, it is not because we see in these articles the material receptacles of homogeneous human labor. Quite the contrary. Whenever, by an exchange, we equate as values our different products, by that very act, we also equate as human labor the different kinds of labor expended upon them. We are not aware of this, nevertheless we do it. Sie wissen das nicht, aber sie tun es. This quote, and the German-emphasized final line, is from the first chapter of Das Kapital, Volume 1, by Karl Marx. It deals with the concept of commodity fetishism, a foundational Marxist idea about the social relations we form around the products we make, that we imbue in these commodities value that does not exist outside of the social action of exchange. The numbers in my bank account are as artificial as the $650 Lego has put on the new UCS Venator set. What is real is the labor that produces articles of utility, like real things, products, that then become commodities through social relations. Commodities such as horror movies, special effects makeup, and gory slashers. Stay with me here. I am going somewhere with this. That last line of the quote, that we reproduce this societal mode without knowing we do it, is taken further by Marxist philosophers to apply to ideology broadly. A simple, neat definition. Just as we require material goods, technologies, and such to reproduce ourselves every day, so do all other aspects of how we interact with the world. We need to eat, sleep, and drink water, and we need access to food and somewhere to rest in order to do this. Those material conditions will affect not just our ability to reproduce ourselves, but what we will become after a cycle of reproduction. For a simple example, if I don't get enough sleep, I don't just reproduce myself for another day, I reproduce a sleepier version. This new version of myself will be slower to get moving, probably make more mistakes, and be less happy. If this continues, I can create a version of myself with chronic fatigue, which can start a cascade of other effects that change the course of my life. Access to good sleep is to my own life as ideology can be to reality. To pick an idea close to home, the ideology of homophobia and transphobia uphold a reality of cishet normativity. A world in which anything outside of the gender binary does not exist and queer attraction is not possible. This normativity requires homophobia to reproduce itself, both individually and on a societal level. If we choose to reject that ideology, though, we can construct for ourselves a new reality. This one is still ideological, only a good and cool ideology where we let everyone love and live as they wish. We have to keep believing in that if we want a reality of tolerance and freedom to exist, though. It's a daily reconstruction of our world, a conscious act to be better and reject bigotry. We have the ability to create a reality we want to live in rather than just the one we were born into, and the best tool the status quo has for convincing you to recreate it instead of a world that serves you better is to tell you it is not ideological at all, that it is the natural way of the world. Reality requires ideology to reproduce itself, even if we reject the idea of holding some ideological stance. We do this every day when we refuse to see the ideological framework we were born into, that which we have inherited from our environment education, broadly the ideology of neoliberal capitalism. Now, I promise this is still a video on gory, meaty horror movies, not simply dry theory. We can take this framework, ideology simplified as they are not aware of it, nevertheless they do it, and look at the societal constructs that exist around Terrifier. Not as a commodity, the film, but as the labor of its creation into a commodity. Damien Leone was born into this world with many a blind spot, none of which are his fault, honestly, and let me be clear, it is not his personal moral failure to not notice these things on his own. But these blind spots have led the ideology that envelops the horror he loves to become invisible to him. The themes present in so many classic horror films, the perverse consumption and decay of the American ideal in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the isolation and terror of white flight suburbs and Halloween, and the blatant racial violence and class struggle shown in Dawn of the Dead, all of these seem to be lost on Leone. He latched onto the shock and gore, developed his skills as a makeup artist, and sought to emulate his influences in film without understanding the process that created the whole of those stories. This results in accidentally copying the best and worst elements of classic horrors. He created a haunted house ride that could showcase his work and his original character and called it a horror movie. Along with the gore and the aesthetic of his inspirations came the fractured elements of their themes and stories, both the enduring and spoiled by time and consciousness. This has resulted in setups that have not paid off and payoffs that have not been earned. The film is a shallow puddle when it's still, looks like a mirror, a reflection of Leone's favorite stories. But disturb the surface at all and becomes meaningless, and we can see the lack of depth present. Damien Leone does not know what he does, nevertheless he does it. And I could leave it there, having Savage Terrifier like one of its own kills, but the entirety of this review, frankly, most critical reviews, exists within an assumption itself, a political technology that becomes apparent if we ask a simple question. Why does this matter? The good or bad checkbox? The number of stars or percentage score given to a movie? Sure, I think I made a strong argument for the category error, that Terrifier is a haunted house ride, a showcase, only called a horror movie because that's how Damien Leone could best get his work to his audience. But then what? People love Terrifier. They love the uniquely savage and creepy character of art. Damien also seems to understand the limitations of what is acceptable.
I'm curious because of like the hacksaw scene and like the reputation that Terrifier has, is it ever kind of like nervous and making sure you like get top the gore or at least bring that kind of action? Or you can do it really well, but is there ever any kind of like nerves about bringing that for this kind of movie?
There are, I've said this before, there's lines that I personally feel maybe you can go too far. Even still, I know Terrifier goes really far, and there's a lot of people that will probably already find it very off-putting. But when I'm designing a scene like that, for me, it could actually be like 10 times worse. And I say, we could take it here, but I know that's too much and we have to stop here. Because I do also want it to be more extreme than your typical Hollywood R-rated movie, but I don't want it to be so extreme where it's not accessible.
So he's not just a simple edgelord. He is thinking about what he makes with the audience in mind. He's just doing this from the perspective of a makeup artist first, a filmmaker second, and a storyteller last. My argument so far has been twofold: a subjective critique and a personal feeling all wrapped together. I did not like the movie Terrifier. I think Terrifier fails to be a horror movie. These are separate statements presented together, the implication being that because I can say I didn't like the film along with having a legitimate criticism, that the film is somehow bad, and that's the final verdict. Is this true? I won't be coy about this point. The answer is an emphatic no, and the lack of introspection many a savage critique displays feels intellectually dishonest. So let's take a look at the broad world of horror, and see if there is something to add to this conversation. Something out there with a shocking and enthralling coat hanging on a languid story skeleton that is widely critiqued for promising much and delivering little, but excels in one specific area that appears to simply be a love note to the creator's influences more than anything radically new. One difference this time? It's gotta be something I love. Scorn is an atmospheric horror game that was announced in 2014 and not released until 2022, following a tumultuous development process. It captured attention with its gruesome and gory blend of flesh and machine environments, and the promise of living weapons and monsters coming out of the walls. The game throws you into this haunting world with no preamble, and you control a human-like creature that crawls across a desolate wasteland towards a giant structure. You then fall into an underground factory where the game gives you control. There is no dialogue, there are no tutorials, no signs or notes to find. You simply start interacting with things with the hope of moving forward. The first machine you find is a tube on the wall that bolts a gauntlet to your wrist with a key that will allow you to work more machines within the factory and the game more broadly. You are forced to work the factory's purpose, which requires savaging a creature that is clearly not human, but has some features like one. Once its torment is complete, you move deeper into the factory, getting a tool made of flesh and bone. In the heart of this section is a sort of reactor, I think. I'm going with the factory vibes. This core is overgrown with flesh and veins, and you use your tool to repair it only for it to rupture and it knocks you unconscious. You wake up later attached to a massive growth that you grotesquely remove from your body before falling into a windswept desert that looks like the remnant of a great catastrophe. There are bodies everywhere, desiccated amongst debris and sand dunes. After a long, lonely walk, you return to the facility only to find you are no longer alone. There is a creature lurking around, and it stalks you through the level as you operate more alien machinery that seems to be a fusion of metals, flesh, blood, bone, plastics, and stone. There are logic puzzles and maze elements as you keep moving forward. Then the lurking creature attacks. It then merges with you like a massive parasite, and you suddenly regain access to the first tool you lost when the reactor burst. There's a theory that in reality, we woke up in a different vessel after the first act, and that this creature is actually the first protagonist character we were controlling, now mutated beyond recognition by whatever was in that part of the factory. We progress further into more intricate puzzles as the factory enters more and more decay and infestation with bizarre organic growths. We become a macabre janitor or repairman until we encounter the first hostile creature, an eldritch entity that looks like a fleshy lichen wrapped in skin. We find more utility organisms that provide more weapons, health, and ammunition. As our living tool belt grows, we find ourselves nearly out of the facility in a large elevator shaft. On top of the massive industrial elevator is a even larger entity with a sunken face and gaping maw. Preparing for the elevator to ascend wounds this creature as it has adhered to it, and each cry seems to call more of the infestation to you. From here you ride a monorail to a massive castle across the desert. It is here that you navigate a strange cathedral adorned with statues that seem a little, It gives temple to avoid god of fertility vibes. You progress in much the same way, operating machinery, destroying organisms that stand in your way to advance. You remove your parasite in a medical bay, then repair a pair of androids, eat your heart out, atomic heart. Then you enter the inner sanctum, are vivisected, attached to a hive mind, and then you gain control of the androids and walk your character towards a portal, an implied escape, an afterlife, or other dimension. You are stopped as the parasite returns and fuses finally with the humanoid you've been controlling, and the game ends on the grotesque creature it remakes you into. Like I said above, this game had a rough development cycle that included multiple rounds of funding, a scrapped 2-part release, and multiple delays and reworkings before it eventually released in 2022. I actually remember seeing the pre-alpha teaser they posted back in 2014 to start their first round of funding, and the bizarre and grotesque scenery mixed with a gun loading teeth-like bullets immediately caught my attention. I was one of many that had a sudden thrill at the new information released by the studio, Ebb Software, in 2021, and the Steam page appeared for pre-order. When the game was released, it was to fairly lukewarm reception. The combat was clunky and sporadic, the puzzles were so oddly spaced out and just absent for significant sections, long checkpoints with no obvious indicator where you would return if you died, and a lack of commitment to any set of mechanics other than walking and door opening. The aggregate reviews are a little kinder now since its release, but it still has barely a passing grade. The one thing players and critics continuously praise is the atmosphere and art, frequently suggesting it should have simply been a walking simulator rather than grasp at other game mechanics it did not commit to. that art direction has unanimous praise. Ebb Software is a small studio from Serbia and claims H.R. Geiger and Zdzisław Beksiński as the primary artistic influences. H.R. Geiger is probably the more well-known of the two, and certainly the one I was more familiar with when I first played Scorn. Geiger was a Swiss artist with a style he calls biomechanical, representing the human bodies interwoven with machine and metal. He works primarily in painting and sculpture. His most famous work is the xenomorph design from Alien, as well as the set design for the space jockey and his ship. This catapulted Geiger's style to legendary status in sci-fi and horror, whether people know his name or not. The director of the game, Lubomir Pekler, specifically states that he wanted to have Scorn be a study of the space jockey and incorporated that idea into the entire narrative and flow of the game. Zdzisław Beksiński is a little more obscure and mythical in many ways. A Polish artist who was born in 1929 in southern Poland, he trained to become an architect. He found the work tedious and began painting, sculpting, and exploring photography in 1955. He never named any of his works, and they all carried this foreboding, apocalyptic character that are either landscapes of sublime nothingness or dark portrayals of something uncannily human while being clearly inhuman. Beksiński actively rejected any interpretation of his art and was somewhat reclusive, preferring to keep to himself rather than engaging with the broader art society. He kept up this mystery and refusal to be interpreted up until his unfortunate murder in 2005. What this man went through during the Second World War, what he would have seen, defies words, and it is appropriate that his best recollections are likely in his paintings. He had obsessive-compulsive disorder, which by his own account limited his ability to travel. He also said he had little in ways of artistic inspiration or even knowledge outside of his technical skills. The only art he said ever influenced him was classical music, which he frequently listened to while painting. Two things about Beksiński that I think are critical to understanding where in the history of human expression he and his work stand. The first being his most formative years overlap with some of the most dire, terrifying, and cataclysmic days in human history, let alone Polish history. To spend your childhood caught between Stalin's chauvinism and the Third Reich's genocidal expansion was one thing, but then to have the utter horror of the battles of the Eastern Front open in your backyard is something no human who did not witness it can comprehend. The second thing to help contextualize his art is that he entered the workforce as an architect into a decimated country. And like so many of us, found the job he was in dull and uninspiring. Had he been anywhere but in the Soviet Union, he might not have had the opportunity to bring his true talents to light. It's something that constantly haunts my thoughts. How many Beksińskis are out there now, toiling in meaningless jobs under the threat of starvation or homelessness, rather than achieving the firmament of their human potential? Scorn is not the first to take major influence from this enigmatic Polish artist. Guillermo del Toro, the master of monstrous inversion stories who brought us Pan's Labyrinth, The Shape of Water, and Crimson Peak, has also talked about how Beksiński has inspired him. In the medieval tradition, Beksiński seems to believe art to be a forewarning about the fragility of the flesh. Whatever pleasures we know are doomed to perish. Thus, his paintings manage to evoke at once the process of decay and the ongoing struggle for life. They hold within them a secret poetry stained with blood and rust. We can see both aesthetic and thematic parallels in Del Toro's work. He loves to play with the way people come apart, the way machinery interacts with humanity, and most importantly, that we often can relate to what on the surface appears most monstrous, most different. He also shares a firm anti-authoritarian ethos, evident in much of Beksinski's imagery and work, as well as what can be easily inferred from his life experiences. Beksinski denies interpretation in his art because they are simply a body of emotion and memory. He can't define it himself, so he expresses it in meticulous detail, in skill, without name and without influence beyond his own dreamscapes and classical music. It shows the horror of his youth and the endurance of humanity through it. This oeuvre combined with the biomechanical surrealism of Geiger in the imagination of the artists at Ebb Software to give us an interactive gallery to walk through as homage to these great artists and their transgressive but fascinating, evocative styles. I think you can tell just by how I speak about Scorn that I adored the game. Its aesthetic caught me entirely, and I spent hours simply exploring the empty space of the map, standing in front of a pile of homunculi corpses or at an obelisk growing tumors like a putrid colossus. Something about the bizarre blend of profane, industrial, and religious imagery left empty and rotting speaks to so many things at once and demands you not consider them separately. Climate change, authoritarianism, war, labor exploitation, genocide, bodily autonomy. If you look long enough, you can see these themes swirling amongst the bone and sinew of the terrifying world in front of you. That all said, the game fell flat on its face for what it hinted at. A survival horror with a gruesome twist. Gruesome, yes, but other than that, it's a walking simulator with a few borderless minigames. My first view of the game was focused on the combat, the meat gun, but that really accounted for little of the gameplay when it came out, and it took a long time for it to be released. After promising unique combat mechanics it never really delivered on. Many people were disappointed. A lot returned the game after only a little play, and I can't blame them. If I was told I was going to a unique game of paintball and then showed up to an art gallery, I'd be pissed, no matter what the quality. If I went to an escape room only to find a sculpture garden exhibit, I'd be frustrated with whoever lied to me. I experienced Scorn as a showcase of a very specific style of art, and I loved it. That doesn't mean that Scorn is a good horror game, or even a good game, full stop. With two examples of horror that I've given a similar critique but have different views of, let's get philosophical about this. I'm going to set up a framework here that I think can help us see the whole picture. The working title for Scorn during its early development stages was called Dasein, meaning being there in German, and specifically being in the world in the philosophy of Martin Heidegger. And yes, before anyone logs off who knows Heidegger, I know we'll get there. I'm doing the Abbey thing. Martin Heidegger's view of this concept went beyond just the facts of where we are in the world and more of our participation in it. We are not solitary units observing the world impartially. We are actively changing the world by interacting with it. And in its turn, the world changes us. This is something we see in Scorn very clearly, where we are thrown into a world that we interact with and change, as it in turn changes us. Heidegger's work focused heavily on how we interact with technology in our world, and how it changes the breadth of perception within the world. The tool he uses for this is called Phenomenology, a study that was first created by Edmund Husserl, of whom Martin Heidegger was a student, and darkly and somewhat ironically is responsible for the suppression and near destruction of Husserl's work. The best example we can use is one Heidegger himself used, a hammer. If I place a hammer in front of you, you will only be able to see it from one angle. You do not experience it this way. You do not look at it as a collection of steel and rubber shaped in a specific way, of a specific weight and dimensions. You see it as a tool, with a purpose and maybe even a story. Whenever you use a hammer, you don't focus on the hammer, but the nail. You were experiencing the world through the hammer. It becomes a kind of invisible technology. Now that's the original example, but there is one more relevant to our subject. If you have any experience at all with video games, and for my small audience, that's a safe assumption, imagine a red barrel you encounter in a video game. You come across one and will instantly recognize it as something that will explode. If you shoot it or hit it, boom. This isn't just a fun mechanic, it's a tool for you. It's a failsafe, a quick escape, or a way forward. It's a mechanic that changes the fundamental way that you approach the game's world as you interact with it. This is only something you truly notice if a game were to present you with a red barrel that then didn't explode. Okay, so we have a framework, a phenomenological look at our two stories, but there is another element here, and this is where we return to that little nugget about Heidegger.
Heidegger was a Nazi!
Yeah, and here's where we can turn Heidegger's own philosophy back on him. If we choose to imagine ideas as a kind of technology, something that changes the way we experience the world, changes us in turn, and is invisible unless it stops working, ideology becomes something we use like a technology. Sie wissen das nicht, aber sie tun es. For Heidegger, this was fascism and eugenics. He was brought up in a world where, as a cishet white man of the German intelligentsia, he could see that the world was at a dramatic moment, a great shift and struggle of ideas. What he could not see was all the assumptions that his observations were built on, that the white race was superior, and the long legacy of anti-Semitism in Europe. That the white race was superior, and the long legacy of anti-Semitism in Europe boiling up into an explanation for everything from the start of the First World War to the state of the German economy. If we return to our metaphor, one far less dire and consequential, we can envision the video game as our ideological technology. You would not approach a red barrel in your day-to-day life, pull out your firearm, and then shoot it expecting it to explode. This example exists within an ideological framework that becomes invisible to you unless it stops working. The story you tell yourself about the barrel can only exist while there's another layer of invisible technology dictating your experience. It's ship in a bottle, baby. We are still on the holodeck.
Captain, I have determined how Moriarty was able to leave the holodeck. He never did. Neither did we. None of this is real. It is a simulation. We are still on the holodeck.
With this broader understanding, we can really see how Scorn fits into the framework. We notice the game and the environment because of how alien and unexplained it is to us. It isn't until we start to live within the world does it fade away and the gameplay becomes more clear to us. We find things we don't recognize until we wield them. A mass of flesh is a gun. A brutal implant is a key. A parasite is our inventory. We sat down to play a video game, and that first element became invisible to us unless, of course, it stopped working, which for many people it actually did. Some people went in with far different expectations of what the game would present, and when they were searching for those ideas within the game itself became apparent to them. They no longer experienced the world through the game, just the broken technology in front of them. That is also how I experienced the movie Terrifier, when many people in fact enjoyed it greatly. Through this framework, we can step back even further and realize something critical. These stories did not organically make their way to us. They are produced as commodities and thus are subject to the alterations to their pure form to conform with the dictates of the market. We see this in Scorn's long development cycle and through Damien Leone's struggle to bring his character to the big screen for years. I think much of the criticism of both works can be best understood as a kind of showcase media, one where we make allowance for the legitimate criticisms and change our approach to the film or game overall. The value of these pieces becomes self-evident outside of any emotional opinion expressed without rejecting or ignoring valid criticisms as they were presented. To limit ourselves to holding only one idea in our head at a time, we do the art a disservice, and we do ourselves a disservice. That is not to say it is not important to be able to clearly define what a horror film is versus, say, a thriller, or what a survival horror video game is versus a walking simulator. But it is a spectrum and has a layer of artificiality put over it purely by capital interests and limits the conversation we can have around art. I come away from Terrifier now with a certain fondness that I think is preternaturally there for most fans already. It's a work of theater, an easy-to-access Halloween haunted house ride that is nothing but fun, references to classic horror crafted by the practical skills of a master who truly loves the genre. Terrifier also brings a lot of baggage due to Damien Leone's blind spots, and we should be critical of them. Something I think he does have the capacity to accept and grow from. The fact that these elements of showcase media can exist is a good thing, and just because we can be critical of art doesn't mean we should dismiss it whole cloth. There's an unfortunate simplicity of good or bad movie that reflects the driving force behind the industry, the need to turn a profit. I can't help but wonder what Damien Leone could do if he had the same opportunity as Zdzisław Beksiński to create what came to mind. Right now, his best bet is probably making cult indie horror movies, and I can't begrudge him for that, even if I think, as a horror movie, Terrifier does not deliver. I'm sure we've all picked up a work that was marketed as something it turned out not to deliver on. A fantasy with no fantastical elements, an open world game with nothing in it, or a romance with no chemistry or steam. I think writers, artists, filmmakers are often alienated from the task of marketing their work, finding its niche so that the studio, publisher, gallery, or whatever capitalist entity owns the infrastructure they need to exhibit themselves can make a satisfactory return on investment. I think a critique of art cannot be done honestly without accounting for this dynamic. But I also think we should reject the simplicity that the market's efforts to maximize returns force. Things are not singularly good or bad, one market category or another. They are a spectrum of creation and a conversation between people. In that spectrum, there are orbits of craft and critique, but they are fundamentally part of the conversation, not a rejection of it. To critique a work should be driven by desire to engage with it, not dismiss it. There's an unfortunate trend of anti-intellectualism that runs through the way people engage with media online, and it's really depressing. It's a symptom of the lack of critical thinking encouraged of us, of reading the same 3 approved books in school that are designed not to piss off anyone's conservative parents. That's only becoming worse, and the biggest media critics on social media, YouTube, and other platforms are usually the ones who have enormous blind spots. They can't see past their own place in society, their own experience, or blatantly choose not to. This reproduces an atmosphere of simplistic, good-bad critique every day, with each new piece of art that comes out, pulling oxygen out of the room for real critique, and forcing people into a camp of either loving or hating something, and defending it on moral, personal grounds. Sie wissen das nicht, aber sie tun es. And sometimes the whole picture, the gallery, the museum, the city it resides in, the creator, the audience, the exact year it is viewed in, is an important part of the story that art can tell us. if we're willing to listen. I'm recording this little outro bit right as I finish editing on Halloween night, actually, and like I think a lot of people, I find myself searching for comfort with the deluge of news about the ongoing genocide against the Palestinians, and one of the things that I keep coming back to is this old documentary hosted on Zoe Baker's YouTube page about Jewish anarchists in the 1900s, the struggles that they faced and the battles that they fought, and in many cases won. For example, protesting for the 8-hour work week and other kinds of freedoms that we take for granted today. There's something powerful about the strong Jewish identity of these immigrants, mixed with the utter rejection of the concept of a state that is anarchism, and I think that's a very poignant idea that we see now amongst a lot of diaspora Jews today rejecting Zionism. It's the same fundamental ideology in a lot of ways, and despite how our governments respond to it, it's a rising tide of belief amongst people, and I think seeing that this has been an ongoing battle and that we aren't alone and that we have forebears who have fought and struggled is refreshing and heartening. Well, sorry for the downer on the last bit there, but the world's rough. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you got something out of this video, and maybe even I don't know, tonight is Halloween, Samhain. It feels like a good night to maybe go watch one of these if you're looking for a haunted house ride. I know it's kind of funny ending it with a promotion of the movie I just ripped to pieces. But I'm just going off the top of my head right now, and I'm quite tired. Also, if you have any interest in where I got some of these ideas or readings from, anything that isn't strictly mine really is going to be cited or referenced in some way. You can see all that in Can't think if there's something else I need to add. I mean, I guess that for the algorithm I should tell you should subscribe. That'd be cool. Should probably also I think that's good for the algorithm. I work in SEO stuff in my day job. You think I'd be better at this for my own personal stuff? I've got more than 2 videos up now, so you can go watch those if you haven't watched them yet. For the 10 people. Yeah, I don't think I have anything else yet. I mean, you can follow me on socials. I'm pretty sure I left my link tree in the description. Yeah, do all the things that YouTubers usually tell you to do. I'm telling you to do it now, so you should. I have a tip jar too, so you can give me money. So I can buy myself little coffees that can make sure that I actually get this stuff out on time. We'll see. There's a little jump scare at the end here, so just be aware, alright? I put that in for fun, but I don't actually want to upset anyone.